Tortoises are one of the coolest and maybe most underrated reptiles that you could possibly get. There's tons of species, they're from all over the world, and today we're going to go over the top 5 coolest tortoises that you could possibly keep. I'm Adam, you're watching Wicked's Wicked Reptiles, stick around. Tortoises can be big, they can be small, but they've all got one thing in common. They've got these really cool shells, and most people think that they're turtles. Well, technically, kind of, sort of they are, but they're land-dwelling versions of turtles, right? So I think that these guys are really underrated, and in a lot of places, they're not really kept as much as, say, a leopard gecko or a ball python. So let's get right into it, starting with number 5, sulcata tortoises. And there's a reason why I'm putting these guys at number 5. To keep a sulcata tortoise, you either need basically an entire room dedicated towards your tortoise, or you need an outside enclosure. So I think that a sulcata tortoise, you're better off being from somewhere like Arizona, Southern California, somewhere where you can keep these guys outside all year long because they get freaking huge. We're talking almost 100 pounds these guys get. They live forever, 70 years plus. These are going to be with you for a long time, and they're going to get quite large, so it's not something you can just stick in a fish tank in the corner of your room and forget about it. All tortoises have one thing in common. They need room to roam, they need their food to be spaced out so that they're foraging all day, because that's really all they do, and you need them to have a lot of space. And by a lot of space for a sulcata tortoise, or African spur thigh as they're called sometimes, I'm talking about something like 20 foot by 20 foot, something like that, like an entire backyard, a big pen, and they need it to be kind of arid as well. You don't want a super humid environment. You want something that's a little bit drier, and of course, if I haven't said it enough, pretty darn big. So number 5 is African spur-thighed or sulcata tortoises, because they get too big for most people. But let's move on to number 4. Greek tortoises. And I know that Greek tortoises have a bunch of different subspecies, and that is true, but they're a lot smaller than an African spur-thighed, and they don't take as much maintenance as African spur-thighed or sulcata tortoise as well. But just like their bigger, similar-looking cousins, these guys are from Africa, even though they're called Greek tortoises. They do need an arid environment. They come from rocky outcrops in the north of Africa, and they need a UVB light just like an African spur-thighed, but they are much smaller. We're talking way smaller. 5 to 10 inches on average, but still, if you can keep them outside, I would suggest doing it. Now, because they're a lot smaller, you want to have covering over the enclosure. You want something that's not super high, but at least 6 foot by 6 foot. That's minimum. You want it to be a little bit bigger, in my opinion. Just make sure that you have like a chicken wire cover over top, because things like skunks or raccoons or coyotes will make a meal of them if they get the opportunity. And the reason that they're on this list is that they're not super hard to care for in terms of tortoises. I should mention tortoises do take a little bit more upkeep and space and time than, say, I don't know, a leopard gecko, something like that. But they don't have crazy humidity requirements, not crazy temperature requirements. Overall, they're pretty darn easy when it comes to tortoises. And that brings us to number 3, leopard tortoises. This is our last tortoise from Africa. They're also kind of small, not super small, but not super big. You'll need a big type of space for them. Also recommend keeping them outside. They need UVB light. You're seeing a pattern evolve here. 10 to 18 inches is where you're going to find these guys most likely. There are some outliers which will get way bigger, but in general, these guys are going to be in that range, which is pretty big. But overall, not a super ton of space. You're going to want something that's going to be the size of half of a room. If you're going to keep them inside, like 10 feet by 4 feet, 10 feet by 6 feet. So you're going to want something that's like a pen, the edge of your room or the end of your room. You can't really keep them in, I don't know, like something you'd keep a leopard gecko or a garter snake in. What's really cool with leopard tortoises, though, is that you can cohab males with males because they're not super territorial like sulcata tortoises, for example. So you can keep a bunch of them together, supposing that your enclosure is big enough to house several tortoises, of course. Don't, have a bunch of them in a small enclosure. And you are very likely to get a captive bred specimen, because importing into the US was banned in 2000. For the last almost 20 years now, the only way that you could recreate them is either illegally or by captive breeding them. So you're likely to get a captive bred specimen, especially if it's under 20 years old. And we'll keep this train moving. Number 2 was kind of a toss-up. I wasn't sure where I was going to put 1 and 2, but I landed on this. Number 2, Indian star tortoises. And here's why they're not number 1. They should be. I mean, they're small. They're the smallest on the list. But they're really expensive, and even if you can find them, they're illegal in some countries, and there's some bylaws against them in the States and Canada. So it's not the easiest to acquire, and sometimes you might have issues if you keep them in your house. As a rule, these guys are between 5 and 8 inches in general. There are monster specimens of different subspecies that get up to 15 inches, but we're talking about outliers here, right? In general, they're one of the smaller tortoises you could possibly get. They are beautiful. They are unbelievably gorgeous. Still, if you can keep them outside, of course, covering them up so that they've got an option to get away from predators. But if you bring them inside for the winter, you don't need as big of an enclosure as you do with the other tortoises that I've mentioned so far. And if you're looking to just do some research on these guys, they come from South Asia, and, I mean, they're really cool to look at. Put it as a background on your phone or your desktop. Absolutely amazing. And if you're thinking about getting your very first tortoise and you have limited space, you live in a small house, and you live in Canada and you can't keep something outside full time, maybe an Indian star tortoise is for you. Alright, number 1, this is my favorite tortoise in the entire world. I should mention up front, I don't have any tortoises because I live in Canada, so it snows most of the year, well, half of it anyway, and I don't have room inside my house. But if I were to get a tortoise, number 1, redfoot tortoises, or yellowfoot tortoises, or cherryhead tortoises. They're all kind of in the same family. They're all very closely related, but in general, redfoot tortoises is how I'm going to characterize this, or how I'm going to categorize it, I should say. They're amazing. They are from South America. They need it a little bit more humid than a bunch of other species, especially all the ones that we talked about. They don't get huge. We're talking right around a foot, 10 to 14 inches, but in general, 12 inches is pretty much how big they get. Cherryheads, if you want something that has kind of like a Darth Maul face look to it, these guys get a lot smaller, or at least a little bit smaller than a full redfoot, and they come from Brazil mostly. So if you want something that has the characteristics but is smaller, cherryheads might be for you. But what makes them really unique is they eat protein, and a lot of the other tortoises don't really need protein. With these guys, it's suggested that you do feed them protein, and I'm talking about if you can feed them Pinky Mouse or chick, they will eat that, where a sulcata tortoise probably won't. So it's very interesting in the wild. They've been observed eating meat such as like monkeys. We're talking about like a dead monkey that's been dead for a day, and they'll just come along and they'll have a meal of monkey. And that is why they're number 1. In my opinion, these guys are the most unique species of tortoise that you can possibly get. They're not huge. They do need a kind of a higher degree of humidity, but that works for me. I live in southern Ontario. We've got a big escarpment that kind of traps us, right? We've got a big lake here and a big lake here and an escarpment holding in all the humidity. So if I were to keep something outside for half the year, it would have to be something like a cherryhead or a redfoot that can tolerate the humidity. And then inside, you don't need a ton of space, but still, I don't know, 6 by 6 at very minimum. Probably better off 10 by 6, which if you had a bigger room, you could make a pen at the end of your room, and you only really need it to be 1.5 feet, 2 feet high, because they're not going to be able to jump out of it. They're tortoises. They're clumsy, right? So that's why I think they're number 1. They're very unique. They're beautiful. There's a bunch of different locales and, yellowfoot, cherryhead, redfoot, whatever, that you can choose from. I don't know. I just love these guys. I think they're amazing. And if I were to get tortoise, that's what it would be. So what do you think? Was this a good list? Should there be something else? Is something that I put on there shouldn't be on this list? Put it in the comment section below. The reason that I did this video is because someone commented asking for it, and that's where I take all of the suggestions and all of the ideas for the videos come from you guys. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, and because I do videos twice a week, that means that I'll see you on Monday.